This is the first conference we've had here in live since 2019, so welcome everyone. You're also here, I don't know about you, but you feel like you're living through history, even though journalism is a first draft of history. So welcome to, there was a guy, a Queens guy, who was convicted the other day of 34 counts of felony, and due to good reforms in our state, he can vote here because of felony disenfranchisement. And it turns out, though, it was kind of rolled back in Florida. If you're convicted in a state with that good reform, you can vote. Anyway, but I'm glad you're here today because you're you're interested in independent journalism, and you've done extraordinary journalism in these last months and previously. But you'll meet some people today who are extraordinary journalists writing for The Nation and other places, and I hope you take away a lot of lessons and skills. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit. First of all, I'm in awe of you because many of you run media operations larger than The Nation, and you're accomplished. And you oversee newsrooms much larger than The Nation. I want to just shout out and call out, we have the editors-in-chief of the Bates Student, the Yale Daily News, University of Texas's Mercury, the Hunter College Envoy, and they're video journalists, podcasters who some of you started your own publications, and a few budding investigative reporters. And I hear there's some culture hounds dying to do the kind of cultural criticism that we do at The Nation. And we have 2022 Puffin Fellow and Yale Senior Thea Chattel, whose recent piece based on FOIAs exposed the Yale administration's long-running complicity with the New Haven Police Department to suppress student dissidents and dissent, and generated more traffic than any Nation article the week it was published. We take this seriously. We have Laura Nora Walton, I just met her, who published 2 extraordinary eyewitness accounts of the dismantling of the encampments at Columbia. And I just want to say that I feel very moved that her mother called in to figure out how to access the live streaming. I'm sorry, Laura. Pride, you need pride in this business. We have Zuri Pope, a student at the University of Cincinnati and a former Puffin Writing Fellow, who's published 15 reported articles for Student Nation about the right-wing efforts to take over the political and cultural infrastructure of the home state of contested Ohio. Confess that one of my favorite Student Nation pieces of the last week was, quote, "Surfers across Latin America are fighting to save the waves and the planet," by Student Nation's very own Alana Cohen. And I also want to single out the more than 50 high school students who are participating via the live stream. And finally, I offer great gratitude to the Puffin Foundation, Neil and Gladys Rosenstein. In honor of their commitment, we've renamed this conference, and special thanks to New School Dean Mary Watson and incredible Kate Tooley, whose assistance was critical to making this day happen. Let me speak for a few minutes about The Nation, its history, its present, future, and how it intersects with this movement moment. The Nation has long focused on sustaining, covering, oxygenating movements. And you campus journalists are here for many reasons, but I suspect a key one is because you understand the importance of movements in making change, real change. We first gathered at the New School in June 2019. Today we meet at a time of similar multiple intersecting crises: health, economic, racial, police brutality, war, humanitarian catastrophe, a time which demands journalism that covers the movements and holds the powerful accountable. Some of you here have founded media institutions. The Nation was founded in this city in July 1865. Woo! I think that's 159 years ago. Launched by abolitionists whose purpose was to ending slavery, the sin and scourge of our country. They were committed to ending slavery, and they believed in the power of the word to do that. What's the sweet spot of The Nation's survival? A commitment to our mission, valuing rebellious voices, challenging orthodoxies and conventional narratives, intelligent, disruptive journalism, and finding that next generation of voices. You will meet a new generation today on these panels. Former Nation interns, Jake Biddle, who's found a beat in covering infrastructure, Layla Al-Aryan, who did an award-winning special issue on the vets of Iraq, Sarah Aziza, Zoya Qureshi, and Lizzie Ratner. These are people who have committed to doing the independent journalism that I think, we talk a lot about democracy, we throw the word around too much, but I do think an independent press is necessary. I'm proud that among the Nation's contributors we count virtually every major voice that has spoken out for social, racial, economic justice, peace, civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights, environmental justice, freedom of thought. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an annual report for the Nation from 1961 to 1966. James Baldwin, Naomi Klein, Edward Said was a longtime contributor, Alice Walker, Bill McKibben, Tony Kushner, Toni Morrison, Chris Hayes, Jeremy Scahill, Ellie Mistal, who you'll meet later, and Dave Zirin, who's been to many of these conferences. All wrote, many continue to write. But while we honor history, we care deeply about the present and nurturing, recruiting, and introducing the Nation to a new and next generation of readers, journalists, writers, thinkers, and activists. Let me just tick off a few pieces of history that guide us, illuminate our work today. As I said, the Nation founded by abolitionists to keep up the fight for racial justice in the years after the Civil War and after emancipation. Arguably the most consequential movement for justice, one of in world history, but its editors and writers recognized that winning was not a one-time question. It had to be sustained, advanced, pressed forward. No victories are forever safe. I'm sure you feel that. You look out today at a report last week that revealed school desegregation hasn't quite worked out as hoped. And you'll hear from Ari Berman, who's now at Mother Jones, former Nation intern and editor and writer, about the slow motion gutting, not that slow motion anymore, gutting of the Voting Rights Act. The Nation's creators also understood, as we do today, that the press, magazine journalism specifically, had an essential role to play in holding the powerful to account, to ensure that promises were upheld and fulfilled. In the late 19th century, the Nation's editors helped launch the peace movement by announcing, catch this, the annexation of Hawaii and the conquest of the Philippines, and helping to organize the Anti-Imperialist League along with Mark Twain. The Nation fiercely condemned lynching and served as a bridge between abolitionism and the early civil rights movement, co-founded by Oswald Garrison Villard, then an editor at the Nation, and the NAACP. The NAACP had its first headquarters in the magazine's office, as did the ACLU, which began as the Anti-War League. The Nation has long supported the labor movement. I don't know about you, but in the last couple years, there are more and more young journalists interested in covering labor because there's a kind of resurgence we're seeing. We've covered the labor movement from novelist John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, writing about farm workers in the 30s, to Jane McAlevy's recent coverage of the new wave of strikes, particularly the UAW. You may not remember Ralph Nader. I hope his obituary begins with how he brought us the seatbelt. But he published The Safe Car You Can't Buy in 1959 while a student at Harvard Law School. It later turned into the best-selling Unsafe at Any Speed, and he was widely credited with bringing us the seatbelt and inventing the consumer rights movement. The Nation editorialized against the Vietnam War more than 60 times, defended campus protests and demonstrations at that time, and condemned the violent suppression of peaceful demonstrations, such as at Columbia in 1968, Berkeley in 1964. The magazine fiercely supported the civil rights movement with early dispatches by a young unknown historian working at a HBCU in the South named Howard Zinn. And as I mentioned, it's not just the annual contributions by Martin Luther King Jr., but when he spoke at Riverside Church in April 1967, a vitally important speech denouncing the Vietnam War, his colleagues in the civil rights movement, almost all of them, denounced him and separated from him. The New York Times and the Washington Post denounced him for disrupting the civil rights movement. The Nation considered his a moral prophetic voice. I'm reminded of why the Nation matters and exists when I think of that. And with a December 6, 1980 editorial, the Nation helped launch the nuclear freeze movement. This sounds like feudal ancient history, but it's important to make the connections back then to what is possible today, which led that nuclear freeze movement to 1 million people in Central Park in June 1982 protesting Cold War U.S.-Russian nuclear escalation, and the demonstration pushed the U.S. and Soviet Union to end an entire class of nuclear weapons. Briefly, the Nation unequivocally, when many liberal publications condemned the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and supported the peace and anti-war demonstrations against it. A special issue on the new inequality in June 2008 drew attention to the problem of a new Gilded Age, 3 months before the financial crisis and 3 years before Occupy Wall Street, which we covered carefully, and which later, in many ways, didn't produce by any measure, but led to the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who we've been covering for some 30 years. Nation columnist Naomi Klein's endorsement of the BDS movement campaign was a significant catalyst for the growth of the movement against Israeli apartheid. Her important features like capitalism versus the climate likewise galvanized the movement against fossil fuels and for climate justice. Finally, Nation has long supported the movement for drug legalization. As early as 1956, the Nation argued the attempt to prohibit drug use, what is an essentially medical problem, and to prosecute users would have disastrous consequences for society. So these are some, there are many more. Today we have Amy Littlefield, who is in the tradition of many of the writers who have fought for reproductive justice. And we continue to find the writers today who echo and build on the history which I mentioned. So unlike the corporate media, and I again was so reminded by reading some of your dispatches from campuses, unlike the corporate media, which too often covers protest as a blight or a problem or a pathology, or too often covers people in power and pretends the differences between Republicans and Democrats constitute the entire debate. We report deeply on the organizing, the movements, the activists, and we speak to and report on the new insurgents. I think not only of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but the new wave of progressives around cities, states in this country, who are bringing bold, progressive policies to their cities, counties, and states, and to D.C. from grassroots to ballot box. Above all, I believe that the work of independent progressive journalism is not just to report on things as they are, it's also to ask how they could be changed, to fight against the view, quote, there are no alternatives. And it is to make change, expose and remedy abuses. I hope you'll feel a connection to the Nation after this day. We're live streaming it. Hope you'll share the video. And please write for us, those of you who haven't. Tell your friends, partners, allies, colleagues about us. We embrace your questions, your curiosity, your passion, your connection to us. And, these are sometimes grim days. And I just remembered there are no lost causes in many ways. There are only causes waiting to be won. So thank you, and I'd love to take your questions. I brought silence. I brought silence to the room. If you have no questions, I'll sit down.
10 minutes. Don't talk too quickly and too closely to the mic. But if anyone has a few questions, this mic here and that mic there are open. So please come forward just a couple of minutes if you have anything.
Uh-oh, I suppressed questions.
And if no one has anything, we can move along. We have a long day. So. Oh, we do have someone. I'm talking over you. Excuse me. Just to flip the switch on the side.
There we go. Could you talk a little bit about your career in journalism and writing?
Yes. I, editor of high school newspaper. You can see how proud I am of it. Editor of the alternative weekly, the Nassau Weekly at college, and freelance writer to a certain extent. In college, I wrote for the press club, so you'd get some bylines in newspapers. But I forgot to mention that I was a Nation intern. So in that context, I was an assistant editor intern, and then assistant editor, and then an editor at large and at Liberty, which was a great position. And I spent about 10 years in and out of what was then Soviet Union, Russia, Moscow, covering the scene, which was at that time vibrant and changing and opening up, ending censorship. But I wrote for the Washington Post and the Nation, dispatches, and also, if you can believe it, I worked for a Glasnost, very open newspaper called Moscow News, covering the first quasi-democratic free elections for the parliament in 1989. Then I came back to New York. I worked in documentaries for 2 years, made a documentary called The American Inquisition, which was about ordinary, quote, ordinary people being caught up in the McCarthy years, which are reminiscent in some ways of today when you see people going down to Congress and the President of Columbia, in a way, kind of throwing faculty under the bus or naming names in exchange. But I came back to the Nation. Victor Navasky, great late editor, went off to for a sabbatical, and he asked me to sit in his chair. And I then became editor in 1996 at a criminally young age. And you're all criminally young. And that has been my life for about 1995 to 2019, and I remain involved as publisher, continue to write. I wrote a column for the Washington Post for 7 years, and that was interesting because you bring your views to that space, don't check your integrity at the door, and they think you're kind of far left. But you know, it's very good, I believe, in engaging people where you can. But that's a short summary. Thank you for asking.
Can you talk about ensuring comprehensive coverage and a diversity of voices within really nuanced issues on campuses and otherwise, like the encampments and Jewish voices, but also Muslim voices, and just ensuring everyone is heard, and if there's any parallels to other social issues and social movements that kind of have the same nuance level that you have to ensure as with pro-Palestine demonstrations?
Very good question. I think this is one of the most, take for example the Iraq War. It was more didn't have the nuances in my view, the Iraq War, though we did have a long-time contributor, columnist, Christopher Hitchens, who was opposed to was for bombing Saddam Hussein in 1991 because of his gassing of the Kurds, a human rights issue. But the magazine was uniformly anti-war, whereas I said many liberal publications. We have been, I think, open to debate, open to a range of views, but not open. You talked about Jewish Voice for Peace. We've been open to views from Israel, from peace groups which are besieged, but we've been committed to covering the Palestinian issue and giving voice to Palestinian voices because there's such under-coverage in the mainstream press, and because of our commitment over time. I mean, as I said, we had Edward Said. We did a special issue on the myths of the Middle East in 1982, which you could reprint today, changing very little. So I think there is nuance, but the humanitarian catastrophe has demanded our attention and reporting and commitment. We give attention. We had this piece about how the left views Hamas, which was critical in some instances. It's not, in my view, a liberatory force, a resistance force, but it was elected in 2006 because of the failures. But I do think that history bears some attention too, and we try to give that in our coverage. I think for us the most important thing, and one of our great editorial board members, Eric Foner, I sent him one evening our 14 dispatches from campuses, student dispatches, and he said this is exactly what the nation should be doing. First-hand coverage by students who are living in the space. So that's what I think we've benefited from extraordinarily.
When we're talking about student journalism and writing in a college setting, what do you think are the unique responsibilities and challenges we should be keeping in mind as students that are different from perhaps normal journalism?
It depends on an editor too, because when I was editing the high school paper, we did engage with the world at large, and an editor might decide just to cover the student business. I mean, look at what Harvard has done. It appears University of Chicago has had for years what they call a Neutrality Act, but Harvard has now decided, the administration, not to cover controversial issues outside of its core responsibilities. I think students have a commitment to cover the campus and what's happening on campus and the world around you on campus, but not to disengage from covering issues that are burning and of the moment. I mean, would you, if you were at Campus Newspaper Day, would you not cover the Trump verdict? I mean, would you not cover what's going on in Rafah through voices, columnists, coverage? I mean, KCRW, I think it's KCRW at Columbia, continued broadcasting after the police came on campus. That was a public service. That is unusual. That is an emergency. But I do think student papers have a commitment to cover not just the internal workings of their campus lives. What do you think?
Thank you for asking. I think the balance between managing the local student scene and then the world events is that's what's really difficult to chart, because it's very easy for a paper to become,
Right.
Kind of just talking about what they're serving in the cafeteria versus, kind of overstepping their bounds and talking too broadly. So I think striking that balance is probably the most important.
But if you were covering what people are eating at the cafeteria, you might also cover what people are making, who are serving at the cafeteria. There are all kinds of things that engage larger issues that are also seated in the campus. So, thank you.
Hi. So I wanted to ask a question. Safety is obviously never guaranteed, like in the world when you're walking about, but specifically regarding covering student protests, like saying that you're someone who supports Palestine right now when it is dangerous to do so, how do you guys take steps to ensure your safety?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. We think about safety in different ways, not to diminish important question, but we've sent people into war zones.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you deal with that? How do you provide for safety? There are some elements of war zones on campuses we've seen. There was a poll, I think a poll published in The Guardian, showing most of the protests were peaceful because they've been perceived as, what would you do at UCLA where no one, I think I would as an editor journalist want to do much more reporting on what happened there as a lesson for other protests that will come. But it's a good point that we should have some thinking, even not a manual, but how do you speak to a student journalist, for example, who's in the midst of a campus crisis, conflict. But I do think that student newspapers might think about that too, in conversation, if you can, with university college administrators. Because it's a very serious question. And you saw in New York, I guess Columbia didn't have security,
Right, yeah.
so they bring in the police twice. Fortunately, the last time it wasn't as violent. I think UCLA has been the most violent, though we've covered in Indiana, University of Indiana, Indiana University, and University of Massachusetts at Amherst. One thing I'm worried about, and this was a note from a faculty member at, I won't name where, but he's been called to testify because the university said you participated in violence, disruption, in protest, and you must come to this meeting on June 6th, and this is with a personnel provost, whether he's going to be suspended or ousted. And I think we'll see a wave of that because, not the university administration, but the faculty in many places, has been a supporter or involved in support and protection of protesters.
Thank you.
I knew this was going to happen. No questions now, too many. We have like 3 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get everyone else who's standing up here, but please try to ask quickly, and Katrina will try to answer quickly, and we'll move on, but thank you.
Yeah, so I saw that you did your undergrad at Princeton. I'll be going to Princeton in the fall, but I wanted to ask, how can students hold institutions that are, just have just massive endowments and are just super powerful in the political sphere accountable? And what happens when student papers, I'm thinking to like the Daily Princetonian, for example, don't feel like they're for the students?
Can't speak to the latter, but I would say that over time, we have a contributor who was at Columbia in 1968. I say that only because at that time there was a project called Who Owns Columbia? There have been projects over time. I would try to find an economist 2 or 3 in the university who has done endowment work. This is not, I hate to say rocket science. They're pretending they can't because the endowments have become more financially difficult since apartheid in South Africa. But you could map some of what is available in the endowment and begin to speak to people who've been involved in the climate divestment movement too, because they have gotten Princeton to support partial work on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Sure. Hi, thank you for your words. My name is Annika. I am thinking about how this year I and a number of my peers at other schools have endured pretty nasty online hate and doxing campaigns tied to coverage. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how, as editors of campus papers, we can kind of promote our and our reporters' safety when our infrastructure differs markedly from, I think, that of professional newsrooms and things like that.
Well, I mean, this is online, right? I mean, obviously. I came here this morning, and after taking pictures of the front page of newspapers, I'm really old-fashioned, like defeat, convicted, guilty. I went on Twitter, which I do in the morning, I confess. Got a lot of hate because I'm an outlier and I feel we need to end this war in Ukraine, but I'm called every name under the book. I made the mistake of taking a picture of my newspaper with my label on it, and someone said, delete the label, redact it. Physical safety is very, very important. Have you had incidents? I mean, the docs, I think there's a level where you got to sort of take this stuff online. If it moves over, then there's a call for security. But there's no question there's also a gendered kind of doxy go on. You could write about it. Michelle Goldberg, who was at the New York Times, was with us for 2 years. Her best piece was about Twitter feminism and Twitter wars and how you protect yourself. But I do think there should be counter-push, like Bill Ackman doxing at Harvard. You could do a campaign on how he's going to vote for Trump. But I think there should be a pushback within limits, and physical safety has to be prized.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Oh.
Hey, my name is Jaden. I'm from
Hi.
North Central College. I'm just asking, since you touched on the Garrison influence a little bit earlier, I wanted to see about where it's going now in terms of environmental justice here in New York. Is there any lobbying the nation does or anything of the sort to try to make sure policies are enacted?
Yeah, I mean, we partner both state, local, national, but we push for different kinds of legislation. Forgive me, I didn't catch the very top. You said you began, does the nation
lobby or of any sort for environmental justice?
Yeah, I mean, we've been involved with local newspapers lobbying for green action in this city and state. We've been involved with the 350.org campaign, so we do ally with movements which are more on the front lines of pushing for change. And not only that, we believe mostly in the movements bringing change, but we are not a nonprofit. You can believe it. I mean, one unifying mission is we've remained mission-driven, but haven't made a profit. That's a different discussion. But we endorse candidates. I mean, we endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016, who I think had a strong environmental plan and continues to do so. And we'll call out, more important sometimes, the predators, the oil companies. And we started a program, check it out, called Covering Climate Now, which also lobbies, but it was founded by The Guardian, The Nation, Columbia Journalism Review, and it's about bringing resources on climate crisis to newsrooms globally. it's worth checking out for your work too. People, you could use it in your newsrooms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, some writers and editors at my school newspaper have asked about like adding their own analysis into like outside of the opinion section into articles. When do you think that's a good idea for student journalists? And if so, like how do you go about that in a way that, you know, is still non-biased in a good traditional journalism?
So at The Nation, we're honest about our views. You know, there's a cliche, you have a right to your own opinion, not your own facts. We have some of the ace fact checkers of the world here in this room and elsewhere. But I do think you can see it in the New York Times. I use that. If you look at the front page, that is so old-fashioned, 4 of the 5 might be analysis. So they're billing it as such, but I don't believe there's an objectivity. I think as I read stories about areas I know, it kind of comes laced through, but I would continue to separate opinion and news coverage. But many of the college papers have very good opinion sections, so keep it there. But you could have analysis as part of the news reporting. But it's all changing. I mean, there's such a premium on voice, which can be not as, I really believe in deeply reported pieces, investigative reporting, and opinion. But keeping that honest is important, because the New York Times, the honesty quality about what is news and opinion is not clear.
Thank you, that's helpful.
So I look forward to the panel.
Sorry, last question here. I'm Fatima, I'm from UT Dallas. I'm wondering how the Nation typically approaches anonymity requests from student activists. In my experience, many student activists are concerned, validly so, about safety and doxing, but also don't want to go on the record, and thus we can't use their quotes in actual stories. But of course, it's important to have the voice of the student activists. So how do you guys typically approach getting those anonymity requests?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I thought you were talking about the Nation running anonymous writers, but in sourcing, I think there's a value. If you trust, you've interviewed someone, you could give some context without naming a name. And if there's security reasons, I still think the value of the news, of truth, of different kinds of sourcing overtakes the usual presumption not to go anonymous. Look at the news reporting sometimes from Washington, D.C. You get a major news story about we might send weapons, and it's an anonymous source, right? You got like the Secretary of Defense, not on the record. So you could say that my source wasn't on the record, especially to protect someone who feels there might be physical retribution. But I do think there's important sourcing that is not from officials, but from protesters, demonstrators, that's valuable. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.